To exist within the imperium of man is to bear a weight that crushes both flesh and soul. For the teeming trillions inhabiting the hive worlds, the tithe is measured in endless toil, blood, and the slow grinding of generations into dust. Yet there are those who face the merciless demands of the administratum in the absolute isolation of the void. Far beyond the guiding light of the Astronomicon, out in the unforgiving fringes of the segmentum obscurus, the crushing economic pressures of the Imperium force desperate men into the dark. They are the void scavengers, solitary wraiths haunting the graveyards of dead stars to meet impossible quotas. One such phantom is Elias, a man worn thin by decades of radiation and despair. He sits entombed within the cockpit of a tiny, rusting salvage vessel named the Carrion's Wake. The atmosphere inside the claustrophobic cabin is heavy and foul. It reeks of sharply metallic, repeatedly recycled air that burns the back of the throat with every breath. Beneath his worn boots, the deck plates vibrate with the agonizing hum of an overworked plasma drive that constantly threatens to fail. The only illumination in this floating coffin comes from the flickering amber glow of the auspex array, casting long, bruised shadows across his exhausted face. Elias is not an explorer of the unknown, nor is he a brave pioneer charting new frontiers for mankind. He is a desperate bottom feeder, utterly bound by the uncompromising chains of survival. To understand his existence, one must understand the sacred and terrible doctrine of Imperial salvage rights. In the eyes of the Adeptus Terra and the tech priests of Mars, no piece of consecrated iron or plasteel is ever truly lost. The Lex Imperialis mandates that the shattered remains of ruined vessels are holy resources, property of the Golden Throne that must be reclaimed. Salvage is not an act of opportunism, but a binding religious and legal obligation. Independent scavengers like Elias are granted mere scraps of operating authority, forced into a pact where failure to deliver a monumental quota of recovered tech results in immediate penal servitude or execution. The administratum demands its tithe of dead metal, and Elias must bleed his own life into the void to provide it. Hour after hour, cycle after cycle, Elias stares into the amber depths of the scanner, praying to the God Emperor for a derelict hull or a field of debris. His mind is numb, focused entirely on the desperate mathematics of fuel consumption against the weight of required salvage. The endless static of the void hums a monotonous dirge through the ship vox. Then, without warning, the rhythm of his agonizing routine shatters. The amber light of the auspex flares with sudden, violent intensity. A deep, resonant chime echoes through the cramped cockpit. Elias leans forward, his breath catching in his lungs as the sweeping arm of the sensor array paints a new contact. It is not a loose field of scrap or a minor derelict. A massive, undeniable shadow blots out the background radiation on the scanner screen, vast enough to swallow the Carrion's Wake whole and cold enough to freeze the blood in his veins. The universe did not announce its malice with a flash of light, but with a sickening, inescapable groan of tortured metal. The Carrion's Wake struck an invisible wall of sudden, absolute resistance. Physics itself seemed to curdle around the small vessel, instantly transmuting the empty void into a suffocating gravitational dead zone. This was the terrifying reality of a magnetic snare. When the Empyrean violently disgorges its accumulated detritus into the material realm, it carries the unnatural weight of the nightmare dimension with it. Massive fused amalgamations of thousands of lost ships, ruined orbital stations, and dead asteroids compressed together over millennia. This colossal, unnatural density drags the reliable laws of real space physics into chaotic submission. Local gravity, mass, and inertia are violently rewritten in a single instant, forced to bend to the tyrannical presence of a returning astronomical corpse. The sheer physical force acting upon the fragile hull of Elias's scavenger ship was beyond mortal comprehension. It was akin to a frail, rotting wooden rowboat caught suddenly in the merciless grip of a deep ocean undertow. There was no crashing wave to ride, no surface current to skillfully navigate, only a dark, invisible hand pulling inexorably downward into the crushing abyss. The Carrion's wake was precisely that doomed splinter of wood. It was seized by an invisible pressure that gripped its structural spine and refused to let go. Plasteel bulkheads wept beneath the agonizing strain, screaming aloud as they were forced to bear immense weight within a supposedly weightless vacuum. Within the cramped confines of the cockpit, Elias experienced the absolute, terrifying realization of total impotence. His shaking hands flew across the brass-rimmed flight controls in blind panic. He slammed the engagement levers forward and purged the engine regulators, demanding everything his primitive reactor could give. The small ship roared in furious defiance. Its plasma thrusters burned a blinding white hot, achieving maximum output in a desperate, screaming bid for forward momentum. Yet the vessel did not advance a single inch. Instead, the Carrion's wake was dragged violently and uncontrollably backward. The roaring thrust of its own engines became utterly meaningless against the overwhelming mountainous gravitational tide of the unseen anomaly. Every gauge, dial, and gyroscopic instrument on the rusted dashboard spun into violent, contradictory spasms. Elias was no longer a pilot, but a helpless prisoner shackled to a doomed trajectory. The harder his engines fought to push away, the more the superstructure twisted and deformed under the conflicting astronomical forces. Real space orientation was entirely dead, replaced by a merciless pulling that defied all navigational logic. The empty void itself was reeling him in like hooked prey. The relentless, invisible drag stretched the little ship to its absolute breaking point, turning the mighty roar of the thrusters into a pathetic, strained death rattle. Chapter 3. Death of the Machine Spirit. The inexorable pull had severed the vessel from the Emperor's light. Now the true agony of the ship began. Deep within the armored belly of the scout craft, the primary plasma reactor unleashed a horrific mechanical death scream. Containment fields buckled under an impossible metaphysical stress. Automated safety rights, programmed by long-dead Martian artisans, triggered in a frantic and cascading sequence. Emergency blowout valves ruptured with concussive force to vent the boiling core into the void. The searing, radioactive lifeblood of the ship was violently exhaled into the uncaring abyss. On the command deck, the main console transformed into a lethal snare. Searing arcs of violent electromagnetic feedback surged through the ancient copper veins of the cogitator banks. Every glass auspex screen shattered simultaneously in a barrage of crystalline shrapnel. The once comforting green glow of the tactical hololiths died in a blinding shower of electrical sparks. Then came the most disorienting betrayal of all. The gravitic generators seized in their housings and fell utterly dead. Without warning, the crushing, stabilizing weight of reality vanished. The sudden failure of his safety locks, combined with the terrifying cessation of artificial gravity, threw Elias from the restraint harnesses of his command throne. He found himself suspended helplessly in the suffocating black air. To witness the death of a machine spirit is a profound theological tragedy. It is a trauma that few servants of the Adeptus Mechanicus ever truly recover from. For Elias, this systemic failure was an intimate and visceral horror. He drifted aimlessly above the dead control panels, his frantic hands grasping at the cold iron. He struck the adamantine ignition runes again and again in a desperate rhythm. His voice tore through the gloom as he chanted the litanies of reawakening. He pleaded with the fading motive force that had faithfully animated his vessel. He begged the dying animus of the ship into sparking just one final time. But the grace of the Omnissiah had been entirely stripped from this cursed anomaly. The sacred engine runes remained stubbornly dark. The blessed incense ceased to burn in the ventilation shrines. The transition was agonizing in its sudden totality. Mere moments ago, the bridge had been a deafening chorus of screaming propulsion engines and blaring klaxons. Now that metallic cacophony was violently choked out by an absolute oppressive silence. It was a void of sound so profound that it felt like a heavy physical pressure against his skull. The reassuring hum of the atmospheric recyclers was gone. The rhythmic, pulsing thrum of the warp drive was gone. In this newly forged tomb of floating debris and scorched circuitry, only a single sound remained. Elias could hear the erratic and terrified hammering of his own human heartbeat echoing loudly within his helmet. His active, flailing panic slowly dissolved into a rigid, paralyzed shock. He hung completely weightless in the dark ruin of his domain. The scout ship had become a lifeless metal coffin, entirely deaf and blind to the universe. Without the fierce warmth of the reactor core, the ambient temperature of the cabin began to plummet at an alarming rate. The freezing dark of the uncharted cosmos was already seeping through the thick adamantium hull, slowly reaching inward to claim the solitary beating heart that remained. Chapter 4. The Freezing Dark. The silence of a slain vessel is merely the herald of a far more cruel executioner. The void does not wait for prayers to the master of mankind before it claims its due. Almost instantly upon the death of the plasma drives, the ambient temperature within the crippled hull begins a catastrophic plummet. It is a ravenous, creeping cold that strips the warmth from the very air, seeking to extinguish the frail spark of human life. Across the thick armor glass of the interior viewports, crystalline webbing blooms in the pitch-black expanse. It is a beautiful and terrible frost, sealing the tomb from the inside out. Absolute darkness descends, profound and heavy. There are no distant stars to pierce this gloom. There are no blinking lumen dials, no soft hum of cogitator banks to offer the comfort of a living machine spirit. There is only an abyssal sensory deprivation that immediately gnaws at the frayed edges of sanity. Within this freezing dark, the only proof of existence is the ragged sound of panicked breathing echoing off the bulkheads. Every terrified exhalation from Elias hangs in the air, a thick mist of condensation that falls to the deck as sudden ice. To remain in his standard fatigues means a quiet, frozen death. Thus, the Imperial void suit becomes his only salvation, though it is a salvation that feels intimately like damnation. The standard issue void armor of the Imperial Navy is a relic of brutal pragmatism, mass-produced in the roaring manufactorums of distant forge worlds. It is a bulky, restrictive cage of layered plasteel, vulcanized rubber, and thick thermal weave. It is designed not for the comfort of the weak human form, but solely to deny the void its immediate prize. Elias is forced to wedge his shivering frame into this heavy, joint-locked apparatus simply to keep the blood from turning to solid ice within his veins. The suit seals with a heavy mechanical finality. He has effectively locked himself inside a wearable coffin. Within the claustrophobic confines of the brass-rimmed helm, his senses are violently compressed. His desperate gasps are amplified in his own ears, deafening and rhythmic, bouncing incessantly off the hardened glass faceplate. The metallic tang of recycled chemical air and ancient sweat replaces the scent of freezing ozone. He is entirely trapped, isolated from the wider universe by a few inches of pressurized plating. Yet the psychological weight of the utter darkness outside presses down upon that plating with the unseen mass of a dying star. The human mind, so frail and prone to ruin, begins to conjure phantoms in the absolute blackness. The darkness breeds terror, and that terror magnifies the creeping claustrophobia of the armored suit. He knows the meager battery of his survival gear will only delay the inevitable judgment of the void. Soon enough, his thermal reserves will drain, the oxygen scrubbers will choke on his own panicked exhalations, and he will die a perfectly preserved corpse floating in a silent metal husk. The terrifying realization strikes him with the force of a physical blow. There is no rescue fleet coming from the distant stars. With his own ship completely dead and its life support systems reduced to frozen slag, he cannot remain in this freezing purgatory. The massive, unmapped derelict looming outside his frosted viewport is his only remaining hope. He must brave the darkness, breach that colossal void-born structure, and tear a functioning power cell from its ancient heart before the cold claims him forever. Chapter 5. The Forced Breach. The void suit was a promise of survival, yet it offered only a measured countdown to suffocation. Elias watched the pressure gauge on his wrist display the bleak arithmetic of his remaining oxygen. To remain within the frozen carcass of his vessel was to embrace a quiet, icy oblivion. Survival demanded heresy against every void-born instinct he possessed. He had to abandon the ship to find a functioning plasma battery. The primary airlock had sealed itself shut, its mechanisms fused into a solid mass of warped metal by the crushing gravitational shear. Drawing his cutting torch, Elias began the agonizing work of burning through his own bulkhead. Molten slag drifted in the zero gravity, glowing like dying embers in the suffocating darkness. With a final, violent shudder, the breached door blew outward, carrying the last precious remnants of his ship's atmosphere into the absolute vacuum. Elias pulled himself through the jagged aperture, immediately securing a heavy tether to the exterior of the monolithic structure that had claimed him. He was now a solitary insect, clinging to the hide of a leviathan. Space hulks are not merely wreckage. They are shifting, eternal graveyards born from the treacherous tides of the Empyrean. These colossal abominations are formed over countless millennia, fusing crippled Imperial galleons, twisted Xenos craft, and forgotten derelicts into wandering planets of rotting iron. They are temporal anomalies where the dead do not sleep, and the architecture defies the sane geometry of the materium. To walk upon a space hulk is to tread upon the forgotten sins of the galaxy. The moment his magnetic boots clamped onto the exterior hull, Elias felt the terrible reality of the behemoth. Through the thick, insulated soles of his void suit, a deep and rhythmic vibration shuddered into his very bones. It was the hum of ancient, unknown engines, buried miles deep within the tangled mass of the hulk. Machines that had not been built by human hands ground their rusted gears in the dark, powering systems that should have been dead for 10,000 years. The cursed iron felt almost alive beneath him, pulsing with a sick and sluggish heartbeat. He was no longer standing upon a ship, but walking across the corpse of a butchered god. Panic clawed at his throat, but the desperate need for salvation drove him forward. Dragging his tether link by link, Elias traversed the jagged metallic canyons of the exterior hull. Shadows stretched and warped in the dim starlight, playing cruel tricks on his oxygen-starved mind. He navigated past the shattered remains of macro cannons and the petrified spires of forgotten macro cathedrals. Eventually his path led him to a rusted outer hatch, half buried beneath a frozen cascade of stellar ice and adamantium slag. It was a wound in the armor of the beast, a grim threshold separating the familiar cold of the void from the incomprehensible hell within. Using the last of his torch's charge, he severed the heavy locking mechanisms and heaved the corroded portal aside. A foul, stagnant darkness spilled outward from the breach. Elias leaned over the edge, his breathing shallow and erratic, and gazed down into the impossible cyclopean architecture of the abyss. Chapter 6. The Amalgamated Graveyard. Beyond the breached airlock lies a geography born of absolute madness. Elias raises his lumen beam into the abyssal dark, only to illuminate a graveyard of impossible geometries. This is not merely a shipwreck, but a blasphemous amalgamation of 1,000 murdered vessels. The void-chilled silence is absolute, yet the frozen architecture screams of unimaginable violence. Above the solitary explorer arches the soaring, vaulted ceiling of an Imperial Gothic cathedral, its grandeur torn from a pilgrim barge lost to the warp millennia ago. Shattered fragments of stained glass still cling to the leaden tracery, depicting the weeping faces of ancient saints and martyrs. Yet these holy visages do not gaze upon a sanctuary of the master of mankind. Instead, the sanctified stonework and fluted arches are seamlessly melted into the rotting, ribbed carapace of an unknown Xenos bio-vessel. It is a nightmarish fusion of faith and Xenos biology. Fleshy, petrified tendrils coil through the shattered choir stalls, while gargoyles of cast iron bleed directly into porous, chitinous bone. This is the macabre miracle of warp fusion. In the boiling, formless tides of the Empyrean, the fundamental laws of reality are rewritten by the chaotic whims of unborn gods. The Immaterium does not merely smash these isolated derelicts together in a physical collision. It fuses them on a fundamental molecular level, forcing adamantium plating and xenos marrow to share a single tortured atomic structure. Cold steel veins throb with the memory of necrotic sap, and calcified ribs support the crushing weight of plasma-scarred bulkheads. It is a biological and mechanical hybridization that mocks the very concept of sanity. Within this titanic cavern of rusted iron and dead flesh, Elias is reduced to the insignificance of an insect. The scale of the space hulk is profoundly apathetic, an environment so impossibly vast and hostile that a fragile human life registers as nothing more than a fleeting mote of dust. Whole civilizations could rise and fall in the shadows of these fused monoliths without ever disturbing the slumber of the greater whole. The towering pillars of steel and bone reach upward into a suffocating blackness that devours the light, offering no horizon, no sky, and no hope. As Elias takes his first hesitant steps across a deck plated in weeping iron and fused vertebrae, the oppressive weight of the graveyard presses deeply into his soul. The air is stale and heavy, tasting of ionized radiation, dried blood, and the ashes of dead stars. But there is something far more insidious than the toxic atmosphere seeping through the seals of his suit. The unnatural geometry of the fused bulkheads begins to war against his mortal perceptions. The sheer impossibility of the corrupted architecture exerts a grinding physical pressure on his fragile mind, while the ambient gravity subtly shifts and stutters with nauseating unpredictability. The twisted shadows cast by the shattered saints seem to stretch and linger long after his light has moved on, a silent warning that the steady flow of time has begun to curdle and rot in the belly of this dead Leviathan. Chapter 7. The Temporal Rot. Beyond the grotesque architecture of twisted plasteel and fused bulkheads lies a far more insidious corruption. It is a profound sensory paradox woven from the invisible cancerous radiation of the warp itself. To walk within the silent belly of a space hulk is not merely to traverse a physical ruin of shattered ships. It is to navigate a lightless graveyard of broken temporal laws. Centuries spent adrift in the roiling, malevolent currents of the Immaterium do not simply erode adamantite hulls and ceramite plating. They rot the very foundational fabric of localized physics. Elias raised his left gauntlet, his widened eyes fixed utterly upon his wrist-mounted chronometer. The luminescent digits, blessed by the meticulous tech priests of Mars to keep perfect Imperial Standard Time, were suddenly seized by a frantic and unnatural palsy. He watched in mounting silent horror as the numbers spun rapidly backward, erasing hours, days, and cycles in mere seconds. Then, without warning or logic, the digits lurched forward, jumping randomly through arbitrary decades in a meaningless blur of green light. The machine spirit of the device was not broken, but rather drowning in a localized reality that absolutely refused to obey the sacred laws of cause and effect. This was the temporal rot of the warp, made manifest before his mortal eyes. To truly understand the depths of such an anomaly, one must comprehend the apocalyptic nature of a localized Geller field collapse. When a void ship's protective envelope fails in the deep warp, the metaphysical barrier between the Materium and the Sea of Souls is not merely breached. It shatters entirely, leaving behind lingering invisible pockets of dead time trapped within the wreckage. Within these stagnant atmospheric graves, the linear progression of the universe ceases to hold any authority. Echoes of a distant and terrible past intersect violently with the agonizing present, creating a localized hell where history refuses to die. A desperate death cry uttered thousands of years ago might eternally reverberate through a corridor that, relative to the listener, was only fused together yesterday. Elias felt the crushing, suffocating weight of this cognitive dissonance pressing relentlessly against the inside of his skull. A sickening vertigo took hold of his failing senses as the laws of reality dissolved around his armor. He realized with absolute and terrifying clarity that he was no longer operating within the standard timeline of the Emperor's realm. He had slipped the moorings of standard chronology entirely, becoming a prisoner in a realm where time was a shifting, unreliable illusion. The rational geometry of the universe had abandoned him to the chaotic tides of the Empyrean. His mind struggled desperately to reconcile the conflicting physical data pouring into his optic nerves with the rational indoctrination of his training. The cold panic rising in his chest was a primal, desperate response to a universe that had suddenly discarded its most basic rules. Yet this profound unraveling of time was only the genesis of his waking nightmare. As the chronometer continued its erratic, impossible dance, the protective boundaries of Elias's own perception began to fray at the edges. The unnatural temporal currents swirling through the corridor were already preparing a far more intimate assault on his fragile human senses. Chapter 8. Respiration of the Hull. Standard chronometry had forsaken him, leaving only the oppressive weight of a distorted reality. In the lightless belly of the amalgam, the physical realm began to mock the very concept of inorganic matter. The warp saturated every rusted bulkhead and twisted beam, turning the air itself into a weapon against the meager defenses of the human mind. Elias found his remaining senses under relentless siege. His void suit, forged by the Adeptus Mechanicus to withstand the most hostile extremes of the galaxy, offered no sanctuary against the encroaching madness. The atmospheric scrubbers whined in protest, yet they could not banish the impossible odors bleeding through the environmental seals. A heavy, cloying stench of ancient, sanctified incense flooded his helmet. It was a holy fragrance, the kind that might roll from the thuribles of a great cathedral, but here it was profoundly wrong. Violently, it crashed against the overwhelming metallic tang of centuries-old dried blood. The coppery taste settled on his tongue, thick and suffocating. It was the scent of 1 billion unrecorded massacres, preserved in the cold vacuum and now thawed by the malefic energies of the immaterium. Elias choked on the phantom stench, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped beast. The claustrophobia intensified, feeding upon his spiraling terror. He stared down the corridor, and his frantic eyes betrayed him. The fused walls of jagged adamantium and ceramite were no longer static. They were gently expanding and contracting in a rhythmic, terrifying cadence. The architecture itself was breathing. Ribbed conduits and swollen cables looked less like structural wiring and more like the exposed veins of a colossal beast. With every perceived exhalation of the corridors, the shadows seemed to push inward, threatening to crush his fragile shell. A creeping, icy paranoia seized Elias by the throat. The space hulk was not merely a graveyard of lost ships. It was a living, malignant organism, a leviathan of rot and hatred drifting through the void. The groan of shifting bulkheads sounded exactly like the moans of a waking giant. He was nothing but a parasite moving through its digestive tract, waiting to be consumed by the immense dark intelligence that permeated the weeping iron. His own rationality was failing him, unable to pass the nightmare unfolding before his visor. He teetered on the precipice of a full panic attack, his breaths coming in ragged, shallow gasps that fogged the inside of his helmet. Tears of pure dread pricked his eyes, blurring the horrific pulsing of the walls. Every shadow seemed to reach for him, every dripping pipe hissed with venomous intent. He knew that if he surrendered to the illusion, his mind would shatter completely, leaving him a babbling husk in the dark. Desperation forced his trembling fingers to his waist. He drew his auspex, desperate for a beacon of cold, unfeeling logic to ground his fracturing sanity. The machine spirit of the device hummed softly, a tiny defiance against the surrounding warp taint. He commanded himself to focus on the flickering green lumen of the screen, ignoring the phantom lungs breathing all around him. He had to chart the labyrinth, to force geometry onto the impossible and map his escape. Tracing the fluctuating lines of the auger, Elias forced his leaden boots to move forward. He charted a desperate path away from the rhythmic breathing, stepping blindly toward the utter isolation of the deep, uncharted corridors. Chapter 9. Failure of Cartography. Elias clung to the archaic comfort of a cracked charting slate. Logic dictated that any labyrinth could be measured and conquered, a falsehood he whispered to himself with every hesitant stride. In his trembling hand, a nub of crude lumen chalk served as his only defense against the twisting immensity of the dark. He marked each corroded bulkhead he passed with a jagged white rune, desperately trying to tether his sanity to the physical realm. There is a profound and terrifying reason why the tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus do not trust cogitator-linked cartographs within the belly of a space hulk. The machine spirits of such sensitive devices are easily blinded by ambient radiation, but the true horror lies in the perpetually shifting internal topography of the vessel itself. Forged and fused by the chaotic tides of the Empyrean, the architecture of a hulk is never static. Corridors breathe and warp the moment they are left unobserved. Chambers slide over one another like the tectonic plates of a cursed planet, rendering advanced auspex scanners and geolocators completely useless. Only the most primitive analog methods offer even a sliver of hope, yet even they inevitably bow to the madness of the void. Every junction Elias encountered was a sickening, nightmarish repetition of the last. He stared down passageways choked with a twisted mess of severed plasteel cables and fossilized Xeno's bone, utterly unable to discern left from right. The overwhelming insignificance of a single human life becomes absolute when measured against millions of tons of haunted, decaying steel. He was nothing more than a microscopic mote trapped within the crushed arteries of a dead mechanical god. Isolation sickness, the dreaded and insidious malady of lost void-farers, began to sink its cold claws deep into his unprotected mind. The immense physical weight of the countless derelict ships pressing down upon him from all sides mirrored the crushing spiritual gravity of his abandonment. He was entirely cut off from the holy, guiding light of the God Emperor. He was buried alive in a lightless tomb, where even the most fervent faith struggles to spark. Elias looked down at his slate again, only to find the lines he had meticulously drawn now contradicted the very corridor standing before him. The maze had quietly rearranged itself to trap him. His chalk runes of safe passage now pointed directly into solid walls of rusted slag and weeping pipes. The geometry of the cursed vessel actively defied the fundamental laws of the materium, mocking his pathetic mortal attempt at cartography. Despair rose in his throat like sour blood. His logical mind strained under the absolute sensory deprivation. The suffocating silence of the hulk rang in his ears until it felt like a tangible physical pressure boring into his skull. He took a blind step backward to retreat from the impossible dead end, his boots slipping against the slick, uneven decking. His heel caught sharply on a jagged outcropping of fused deck plating. He stumbled backward, losing his fragile balance in the unnatural gloom. His heavy armor violently collided with the resonant metallic bulk of the corridor wall. The deafening metallic crash tore through the oppressive silence of the maze, echoing outward into the endless blackness like a sounding bell. Chapter 10. The Endless Echo. The silence of the labyrinth shatters with a single damning act of clumsiness. Cold iron slips from trembling fingers. The heavy wrench strikes the rusted grating of the deck with the absolute finality of an executioner striking the block. It is a singular, violent collision of metal upon metal, yet the resulting acoustic shockwave refuses to die. It travels outward, plunging down dark passageways that twist back upon themselves in blatant defiance of Euclidean geometry. By every law of physics, the resonance should quickly decay. It should surrender to the oppressive, suffocating stillness of the void. Instead, the vibration sustains, feeding upon the unnatural architecture of the derelict vessel. It echoes for far too long, bouncing through corridors that mathematically should not exist. To understand the auditory nightmare of a space hulk is to understand a sprawling graveyard of compressed and conflicting atmospheres. Within this amalgamated tomb, thousands of ruptured starships bleed their internal climates into one another. And pockets of highly pressurized oxygen crash into sealed corridors choked with frozen methane and heavy, toxic promethium vapors. These distinct, segregated densities of air act as vast, invisible acoustic prisms. They refract, bend, and magnify sound waves through localized gravity shears and warp-tainted spatial distortions. A simple vibration is torn apart and stitched back together by the sheer physical impossibility of the environment it travels through. Thus, the sharp ringing of dropped iron begins to sicken. As the endless echo bounces through these pressurized crypts, its pitch stretches into grotesque and unnatural frequencies. The clean, mechanical impact softens, curling at the sonic edges until it loses its industrial nature entirely. The metal ceases to ring, it begins to whisper. Overlapping cadences of profound grief and predatory malice bleed upward from the grating beneath. The reverberation decays into the frantic, breathy syllables of long-dead Xenos tongues. These inhuman sibilances layer themselves over the agonizing death groans of ancient void-farers who perished in these very halls millennia ago. The sound weeps in the darkness. It begs for salvation. It promises unimaginable torment. Elias is paralyzed by the auditory hallucination. He stands rooted to the corroded deck, a prisoner trapped within his own terror. Pure, undiluted dread anchors his heavy boots to the grating. He holds his breath, his lungs burning with the desperate, agonizing need for oxygen. He is utterly terrified that even the faintest exhalation will add his own voice to this chorus of the damned. The agonizing symphony of warp-distorted resonance washes over him in freezing waves, drowning his rational mind in the weeping voices of the dead. Slowly, agonizingly, the impossible echoes of the fallen wrench finally begin to thin. The Xenos whispers dissolve back into the heavy, stagnant air, leaving behind an atmospheric silence that feels even heavier than before. Elias does not dare to move a single muscle. He waits for the absolute quiet to reclaim the labyrinth entirely. Yet the silence is violently broken once more. From the suffocating dark ahead, a new cadence emerges. It possesses none of the chaotic reverberation of dropping iron, nor the ghostly distortion of the atmospheric prisms. It is a deliberate sound that belongs to something entirely physical and uncomfortably close. Chapter 11. Rhythm in the Groans. The final reverberations of the dropped iron bleed into the abyssal dark, swallowed entirely by the cavernous throat of the space hulk. Silence reclaims the dead corridor, but it is a deceitful quiet. In the void, absolute silence is a myth born of ignorance. A derelict vessel of this unfathomable scale is always speaking. It groans under the agony of its own localized gravity. Tectonic plates of adamantium grind against one another as the colossal mass drifts through the stellar currents. At first, the new sound creeping into the consciousness of Elias seems to be just another voice in this mechanical choir. It is a low, grating slide against the deck. It mimics the agonizing protest of a ruptured bulkhead yielding to the vacuum. Elias forces himself to breathe slowly, rationalizing the noise as the natural settling of ancient, tortured metal. Yet the human mind, forged through millennia of predatory evolution, recognizes patterns where none should exist. The shifting of debris is chaotic and devoid of purpose. The structural lamentations of a dead ship follow no cadence. But this sound possesses a rhythm. It is methodical, measured, and dreadfully deliberate. A cycle of movement and hesitation manifests in the dark. Dead things do not pace. Dead things do not calculate their approach. To test the terrifying hypothesis blooming in his mind, Elias freezes. He locks every muscle in his exhausted frame, halting his own boots upon the grated floor. If the noise is merely the echo of his own heavy footfalls returning to him through the distorted architecture, it will cease. He holds his breath, transforming himself into a statue of cold, terrified flesh. The corridor remains perfectly still. His own movements are gone. Yet the scraping continues. It does not halt. It does not fade. It grows fractionally louder, peeling through the rusted shadows with malicious intent. The truth hits Elias with the physical force of a hammer blow to the chest. The illusion of his utter isolation shatters into 1,000 jagged pieces. He is not alone in this tomb. His careless mistake has rung the dinner bell in a house of starvation. Something ancient and unspeakably foul has been awakened by the sudden intrusion of noise. The psychological anchor holding his sanity together begins to violently tear away from its moorings. Paranoia takes the helm, steering his frantic thoughts into the abyss. He can hear the distinct difference now between the random settling of lifeless iron and the directed predatory movement of a living entity. This is the sound of a hunter navigating the labyrinth. Every scrape of claw or dragging of mass across the deck plates tells a story of an approaching doom. Elias strains his eyes against the suffocating darkness, abandoning all hope of a quiet death. His survival instincts flare, overriding the paralyzing grip of raw terror. He turns his head by fractions of an inch, dissecting the acoustics of the desecrated hallway. The rhythmic groaning is no longer a nebulous echo bouncing off the bulkheads. It is gaining a frightening clarity, anchoring itself to a physical point in the blackness. Elias tracks the grinding cadence, his mind mapping the unseen geometry of the corridor. He traces the deliberate approach to its exact origin, staring into the impenetrable gloom where the predator finally reveals the direction of its advance. Chapter 12. The Heat Seeker. Elias turns his weary gaze upward toward the oppressive ceiling of the forgotten sublevel. Crisscrossing the gloom above are massive rusted ventilation shafts that have not drawn fresh air in 10 millennia. From within those rotting iron veins comes a sound that completely defies the ambient groans of the dying station. It is the distinct rhythmic striking of multiple heavy limbs against hollow metal. He listens to the deliberate scrape of impossibly hard chitin carving shallow graves into the ancient iron. There is nothing random about this noise. It possesses a calculated and terrifying cadence. He now knows with absolute certainty that a living nightmare is suspended right above his head. In the shadowed bestiary of the galaxy, there exist apex predators designed solely to sever the fragile threads of humanity. This unseen terror is a vanguard organism of the Great Devourer. It is a pure-strain Genestealer bred in the unfathomable depths of the intergalactic void and engineered for absolute lethality. Such Xenos monstrosities are known to lie dormant in the forgotten bellies of space hulks and derelict outposts for centuries at a time. They enter a state of deep, death-like hibernation where their Xenos blood thickens to sludge and their biological functions drop to a near standstill. In this suspended animation, they become entirely indistinguishable from the cold iron that surrounds them. But they are never truly dead. They are merely waiting for a catalyst. The sudden introduction of a singular thermal signature was all it took to stir the beast from its ancient slumber. The faint hum of the power cells strapped to Elias and the meager warmth of his active void suit served as a blazing beacon across a silent abyss. As the suit cycled its recycled oxygen and radiated the heat of a living human body, the creature awoke. Its bulbous, slit-pupilled eyes opened in the pitch black of the ductwork. Its hyper-evolved sensory nodes instantly locked onto the anomalous bloom of heat radiating through the freezing decking. This abhorrent Xenos breed does not wander aimlessly in search of sustenance. It is a flawless biological weapon executing an uncompromising hunting algorithm. Right now, it is methodically slithering through the claustrophobic air vents with a terrifying grace. It traces the microscopic thermal trails rising off the panicked man below. Every terrified shift Elias makes and every shallow breath he takes feeds the creature more tactical data. It matches his pace perfectly while remaining completely cloaked in the shadows of the overhead grating. The clicking of its razor-sharp talons grows marginally louder as it deliberately aligns itself directly above its prey. The beast is savoring the hunt and mapping the blind spots of its isolated victim. Below the rusted iron grate, the sheer terror of this realization begins to take a severe physical toll on the desperate scavenger. The warning klaxons of his ancient life support system start to whine in loud protest as the crushing strain of the hunt begins to rapidly overwhelm his failing machinery. Chapter 13. The Dying Lumen. The predator above was no longer the only betrayal Elias had to face. In the deep, crushing belly of the space hulk, the true enemy was the void itself. The blessed machinery of his void suit, a battered relic of countless labor shifts in the macro bays, finally began to succumb to the ruinous environment. Deep within the armored carapace of his life support system, the power core slipped irrevocably into the crimson threshold. The heavy, shoulder-mounted lumen beam, his solitary shield against the abyssal gloom, faltered. A harsh, high-pitched whine bled through the internal vox beads of his helmet. It was the mechanical death rattle of a dying machine spirit, crying out as its sacred energy reserves were violently siphoned away by the absolute cold of the derelict. The brilliant cone of illumination began to flicker wildly. Jagged shadows danced and contorted with every violent stutter of the failing lumen projector. Once the beam had proudly pierced the gloom for a full 20 meters, revealing the twisted bulkheads and rusted deck plating of the labyrinth. Now that meager sanctuary of holy light collapsed inward. The beam withered to a pale, erratic halo extending barely 5 meters ahead. It was an agonizing, terrifying retreat of salvation. Elias felt the sensation of drowning in an encroaching ocean of absolute black. The darkness of the hulk was not merely the mundane absence of light. It was a living, biological entity, a suffocating presence that hungered for the vital warmth of mortal souls. It pressed against the flickering lumen with a tangible, crushing weight. Here was the ultimate tragedy of the Imperium rendered in cruel miniature. The sputtering, unreliable defiance of human engineering was utterly dwarfed by the ancient, perfect darkness of a Xenos-infested tomb. Imperial technology, steeped in desperate ritual and forgotten dogma, was proving utterly fragile in the face of the primordial void. Panic gripped Elias with icy, unforgiving talons. He struck the side of his power pack with a heavy, gauntleted fist. He battered the adamantium casing again and again in a frantic, desperate physical prayer, hoping to violently coax the dying spirit back to life. The lumen merely spat a pathetic shower of weak static before dimming even further. His breathing grew ragged, shallow, and terrifyingly erratic. Harsh, terrified gasps echoed loudly within the tight, claustrophobic confines of his helm. Hot condensation began to rapidly build across the inside of his faceplate. The thick fog coated the armor glass, blurring the terrifying remnants of his vision into a smear of dying yellow light. The unseen hunter above shifted in the dripping rafters, patiently waiting for the exact moment the light would perish entirely. Blindness was an absolute death sentence in the deep dark of a space hulk. The protective aura of the Omnissiah had completely forsaken this lowly worker. Stripped of the Emperor's guiding light and plunged into the maw of the beast, Elias knew he was out of time. His trembling fingers abandoned the ruined power pack and moved slowly downward toward his hip. With the shadows closing over him forever, he reached for the cold, unyielding iron of his sole remaining defense. The dying light finally surrenders, giving way to the absolute, suffocating dark of the derelict. In this sudden absence of illumination, the phantom horrors of a terrified mind calcify into an inescapable, visceral reality. Elias is no warrior of the Adeptus Astartes. He is merely a serf of the deep veins, a lowly breaker of rock and steel, bound to the endless tithe of the Imperium. Driven by the primordial urge to survive the encroaching doom, his trembling hands reach for the only salvation available to his meager station. He draws his heavy industrial lass cutter from its magnetic harness. This is no holy bolter. It is no blessed chainsword forged by the master artisans of the Mechanicus for the righteous defense of mankind. It is instead a brutal, unrefined implement of mindless labor. Weighing more than a heavy stubber, the mining cutter was engineered strictly to shear through dense adamantium bulkhead plating over agonizing minutes of sustained thermal fury. As a weapon of war, it is a pathetic, laughable instrument. It is ponderously heavy, stubbornly slow to cycle, and fundamentally useless against the lithe, predatory horrors that truly stalk the lightless void. The spooling capacitors whine with a sluggish, painful lethargy. To wield such a tool against the nightmare denizens of the warp is an act of sheer delusion. It is a pathetic blade, grasped desperately by a dying man who refuses to accept that his life is already forfeit. The physiological flood of raw adrenaline ravages his weak, unaugmented body. His heart hammers violently against his ribs like a trapped beast demanding release. Cold, acidic sweat pours freely from his brow, stinging his bloodshot eyes, yet he dares not blink even for a fraction of a second. Inside the thick, pressurized synth leather of his heavy void gauntlets, his fingers shake with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. The immense weight of the mining tool threatens to tear the exhausted muscles directly from his forearms. Elias is drowning in the chemical terror of his own fragile biology. He raises the unwieldy device alongside his flickering hand lumen, his survival instincts manifesting as a frantic, completely disorganized defense. He sweeps the pale, anemic beam of the flashlight back and forth across the corroded deck plates in a manic rhythm. Chasing the weak white light is the angry crimson glare of the cutter's targeting laser. These twin beams violently pierce the rolling banks of heavy condensation and rust-choked fog bleeding from the ruptured atmospheric pipes. Shadows stretch and dance along the oxidized iron bulkheads, mimicking the claws of unseen assailants. Every drifting mote of dust and every swirling eddy of toxic mist becomes a lunging monstrosity in his hyper-aroused mind. Step by agonizing step, Elias yields ground to the suffocating darkness. His desperate retreat is devoid of all tactical logic, driven entirely by an animalistic need to put solid iron between his vulnerable flesh and the unseen terror. His heavy magnetic boots scrape loudly across the grated floor as he backs away from the yawning cavern of the main thoroughfare. Blindly seeking the illusion of safety, he forces himself backward into a cramped, intersecting maintenance conduit. The jagged, rusted walls close in tight against his armored shoulders, violently scraping against his environmental suit. He trades the terrifying vulnerability of the open corridor for the suffocating, inescapable confines of a narrow choke point. His mobility is now entirely stripped away. There is nowhere left to retreat. Chapter 15. The Snag. Elias retreated step by step into the suffocating dark of the lower decks. His last cutter swept in wide, desperate arcs, casting harsh red glares against the bulkheads. He was totally consumed by the phantom threats lurking in the shadows ahead of him. That singular focus on the encroaching dark became his doom. He did not watch where his trembling boots fell as he backed deeper into the bowels of the derelict. The corridor walls began to converge, violently warped by ancient battle damage. The metal bulkheads leaned inward like the crushing jaws of some colossal beast. Without warning, the passage tightened around him. His bulky void suit, designed to withstand the vacuum of space, suddenly betrayed him. A cluster of ruptured, jagged promethium pipes thrust out from the mangled wall. He stepped backward, and the iron-hard shrapnel violently impaled the thick plating of his life support harness. Elias twisted in a panic, desperately trying to tear himself free from the snare. The agonizing screech of rusted metal gouging across heavy plasteel echoed down the passageway. It was the desperate thrashing of an animal caught in an iron trap. Every frantic jerk only buried the twisted pipes deeper into his rigid suit, locking him utterly in place. He was immobilized. He was entirely helpless. Above him, the ceaseless scraping in the ventilation shafts abruptly died. That sudden, suffocating silence was infinitely worse than the horrific sounds of the hunt. When the creature was moving, his frantic mind could at least track the nightmare. The noise had been a tether to reality, a grim promise that the terror was still mortal and bound to the physical realm. The scraping of its claws had allowed his racing heart to calculate distance and prepare for the inevitable violence. Now the absolute quiet stripped away his final, pathetic illusion of control. The void of sound pressed against his eardrums with a crushing weight, heavier than the armored confines of his trapped suit. In this unnatural hush, The imagination became a torturer. Every heartbeat echoed like a thunderclap, screaming his exact location to the pitch-black air. The silence was not an absence of danger. It was heavily pregnant with malice, coiled tight like a serpent ready to strike. It meant the hunt was over. It meant the predator had finally found its perfect vantage point. It meant the unseen abomination was no longer searching, but simply waiting to savor the imminent kill. The silence was the ultimate declaration of his doom, an absolute certainty that his death was hanging mere inches away in the shadows. The freezing air in the corridor grew incredibly heavy. A foul, acidic stench drifted down from the rusted grating directly above his immobilized helm. He ceased his frantic struggles against the ruined pipes. The total quiet of the dead ship demanded his final attention. Trembling beneath the weight of his own profound terror, Elias slowly tilted his head backward. Chapter 16. The Frozen Microsecond. Time ceases its forward march, shattering into 1,000 crystalline fragments of pure terror. Elias acts not on conscious thought, but on the primal instinct of a prey animal recognizing its doom. His arm jerks upward in a violent spasm of sudden panic. The dying power cell of his lumen projector coughs a final, sputtering beam of pale white light toward the overhead ventilation grating. What the narrow cone of illumination reveals is the ultimate negation of humanity. The suffocating silence of the lower decks is finally broken by the rushing displacement of stagnant air. A massive shadow detaches itself from the rusted ceiling and plunges downward. It is a purest-strain Genestealer, an organism born of extragalactic nightmares captured mid-fall in the flickering strobe of failing technology. In this protracted microsecond, the sheer evolutionary perfection of the Tyrannid vanguard is laid bare before mortal eyes. It is a creature entirely unburdened by the flaws of human emotion or the fragile morality of a soul. Gleaming obsidian eyes catch the lumen glare, reflecting nothing but cold, ancient hunger and the calculating void of the hive mind. Its distended, tooth-lined maw falls open in a silent, dripping snarl. Rows of translucent, needle-like fangs are exposed, slick with a venomous bioacid that steams in the frigid air. Every muscle and sinew is a masterwork of biological engineering designed exclusively for the harvest of biomass. Its carapace gleams with a sickly, iridescent majesty. The beast is armored in interlocking plates of deep purple and bruised blue chitin, a bioengineered carapace that rivals the hardness of raw diamond. 4 powerful arms extend from its terrifying thorax in perfect predatory geometry. The primary arms terminate in massive diamond-hard rending claws, capable of parting adamantium as though it were brittle parchment. Against this flawless instrument of the great devourer, the human called Elias is a pathetic study in mechanical obsolescence. His decaying void suit is built from the crude and forgotten templates of a stagnant empire. It is little more than a heavy, suffocating tomb constructed of corroded plasteel and fraying rubber conduits. Flickering amber warning runes bleed across his cracked glass visor, their machine spirits futilely protesting the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. He is just fragile meat, trapped within dying machinery, drawing breaths of stale, recycled oxygen in the absolute final moments of his life. The contrast between hunter and prey is profound and deeply humiliating to the pride of mankind. Here is the absolute pinnacle of biological supremacy, descending freely upon the rotting, cumbersome vestiges of a dying galactic order. In the final fraction of this frozen moment, the mind of Elias ceases to be that of an Imperial servant. He becomes nothing more than a helpless witness to his own bloody extinction. He cannot scream. He cannot raise his weapon to fire. The neurochemical pathways of his brain are utterly paralyzed by a primal dread that overrides all Imperial indoctrination and military training. He is granted exactly 1 heartbeat to comprehend the majestic, terrifying inevitability of the apex predator that now blots out his pathetic light. The looming shadow overtakes his vision entirely as the beast effortlessly bridges the final inches of the empty void. The suspended instant shatters like brittle glass, and the silent nightmare abruptly becomes an agonizingly physical reality. Chapter 17. The Asymmetric Chase. It descended not with the heavy crash of mass-meeting metal, but with a horrifying, impossible grace. The laws of momentum, those immutable dictates of physics that bind every human endeavor, held no sway over the apex predator of the void. It touched the rusted deck plating without a single sound. There was no reverberation of weight, no trembling of the ancient grates beneath its talons. It merely arrived, displacing the foul air of the corridor like a phantom spun from the very shadows of the dying ship. The spell of absolute terror snapped. Elias tore himself backward with the frantic, mindless desperation of a trapped animal. His heavy void suit snagged against the corroded thermal pipes lining the bulkhead. Metal shrieked against metal as he wrenched himself violently free, leaving strips of protective canvas and outer thermal mesh snagged on the jagged iron. He scrambled across the uneven floorboards, a clumsy spectacle of panicked limbs and uncontrolled momentum. Every movement he made was an explosion of desperate noise. His heavy magnetic boots hammered against the deck, echoing like cannon fire in the narrow, suffocating confines of the lower decks. His breath hitched and roared inside his enclosed helmet, a deafening cacophony of human frailty and absolute despair echoing in his own ears. Behind him, the nightmare moved. It did not give chase in any manner comprehensible to a mortal mind. There was no lunging, no frantic pumping of limbs, no bestial roar of triumph to announce its terrible glory. The creature simply flowed forward, a liquid engine of biological perfection designed solely to eradicate life. It was entirely silent. While Elias thrashed and collided with the bulkheads in his blind panic, the Xenos navigated the claustrophobic space with the chilling precision of an executioner blade slicing through silk. It did not boast of its supremacy, nor did it attempt to frighten its prey. Terror was merely a byproduct of its existence, an irrelevancy to a creature born only to consume and multiply. It was a living weapon, forged in the unfathomable depths of the intergalactic void, stripped of every emotion save the cold, mechanical hunger of the swarm. The heavy, archaic technology of the Imperium was utterly outmatched by the seamless bioengineering of the Xenos breed. Elias hurled himself around a twisted support strut, his boots slipping uselessly on a puddle of leaked engine coolant. He fell hard, the impact bruising his ribs through the thick layers of his environmental armor. Driven by sheer, unadulterated madness, the rating forced himself to drag his heavy frame further into the gloom, crawling when his legs refused to hold him. He dared not look back, yet he could feel the unnatural, suffocating pressure of its proximity creeping into his very soul. The distance between them evaporated with a speed that defied logic and reason. The creature was toying with him, perhaps allowing the frail human to exhaust his pathetic reserves of energy, or perhaps merely observing the futile mechanics of human flight. Without a single sound to announce its terrible arrival, a shadow blotted out the flickering lumen strips above Elias. A chitinous appendage, impossibly dense and tipped with diamond-hard rending claws, glided through the air with agonizing slowness. It breached the final span of empty air, brushing against the reinforced plating of Elias' shoulder guard with the delicate, terrifying intimacy of a god of death, finally claiming its rightful tithe. Chapter 18. The Shearing of Ceramite. There is no salvation in the heavy void plating of Imperial manufacture when faced with the apex horrors of the void. The rending strike of the beast does not bludgeon or batter, it glides. The Genestealer brings down its primary rending claws with a sickening, effortless grace that defies the brutal physics of melee combat. At the microscopic level, the edge of the Xenos chitin tapers to a monomolecular point, a biological impossibility that makes a mockery of Imperial engineering. When the talon meets the rigid shoulder plate of Elias, there is no spark of deflection. There is only the horrifying, whisper-quiet sound of an absolute severing. The razor-sharp appendage shears through the outer shell of dense plasteel with the sickening hiss of wet silk parting under a blade. It continues its flawless descent through the dense armor-plus plating, bisecting power conduits and environmental seals in a single, fluid motion. Below the armor plating lies the thermal body glove, an insulated mesh meant to preserve human warmth in the frozen deep. The claw slices through the fabric without slowing, plunging directly into the fragile cage of mortal flesh. Skin and muscle are flayed open in an instant. Bone is sheared clean through, offering no more resistance than dry parchment to the Xenos scythe. The immediate consequence is a violent, explosive decompression. Pressurized breathing gases vent furiously from the massive fissure in the compromised void suit. The artificial atmosphere screams out into the dead silence of the corridor, a sudden gale that tears the remaining breath directly from the ruined lungs of the void-scavenger. In a fraction of a second, the insulated microcosm of his armor is violated by the terrible reality of the space hulk. The freezing, ancient air of the derelict ship floods the open wound, plunging the ambient temperature to near absolute zero. Yet amidst the killing cold, there is a sudden and blinding heat. A panicking, failing heart pumps arterial blood out into the freezing void in thick, steaming ribbons. The crimson spray vaporizes almost instantly as it strikes the dead metal of the deck, creating a fine, coppery mist. This sudden sensory shift is absolute and horrifying. The sterile, recycled scent of the void suit is completely obliterated by the raw, metallic stench of hot, butchered human meat. To a dying man, it is the pungent aroma of his own abrupt demise. To the shadows, it is a dinner bell. The pheromonal signature of spilled vitae is the ultimate catalyst, atomizing perfectly into the stale atmosphere. It wafts down the corroded ventilation shafts and drifts through the lightless, labyrinthine underbelly of the cursed vessel. Deep within the cavernous darkness, in nesting grounds untouched by starlight for millennia, the scent falls upon thousands of dormant sensory slits. The brood, suspended in the cold sleep of the void, tastes the sacrificial offering. Countless yellow eyes snap open in the pitch black. A low, chittering vibration begins to resonate through the bulkheads as the sleeping horde awakens to the promise of fresh harvest. Above them, in the freezing corridor, Elias collapses into the iron grip of his executioner, his broken body twitching helplessly as the monstrous silhouette begins to pull him backward into the endless dark. There is no glorious martyrdom to be found in the rusted depths of a space hulk. There is only the brutal, uncaring arithmetic of the void. The fatal blow did not grant Elias the mercy of a quick release. Instead, the shadows themselves reached out to claim him as a sudden, bloody tithe. With terrifying speed, he was yanked violently backward, lifted cleanly off his boots by a strength born of ancient Xenos nightmares. His final scream was a ragged, desperate plea that tore through his helmet vox, a frantic burst of static and terror that was abruptly choked into silence. In a fraction of a second, Elias ceased to be a living, breathing citizen of the Imperium. He became merely biological raw material, a sudden harvest for the lurking vanguard of the Great Devourer. The absolute darkness of a lightless maintenance shaft swallowed him whole, dragging him violently down into the sprawling labyrinth of the ship. What followed was not a spectacle for the eyes, for the shadows of the cursed vessel kept their wretched secrets well hidden. Instead, it was the sheer auditory horror that stained the stagnant, freezing air. The terrible symphony of a man being unmade echoed endlessly down the iron-wrought corridor. First came the agonizing metallic shriek of his void suit, scraping against the jagged grating as his broken body was dragged deeper into the abyss. There will be no cast-off. There will be no return journey to the scattered lights of the Imperium. Already, the insidious physical contagion of the behemoth is creeping across the umbilical connections. The plasteel hull of the smaller ship is beginning to warp, blister, and rust. Corrupted metallic growths spread from the ancient superstructure, reaching out with agonizing slowness to embrace the tiny vessel. The Carrion's wake is being materially digested. It is melting into the twisted amalgamation of dead battlecruisers, shattered Xenos frigates, and forgotten orbital stations. It has lost its solitary identity to become a microscopic fragment of the terrifying whole. This is the true, eternal nature of the Space Hulk. It is an apex predator composed entirely of its own victims. It is an immortal monument to human greed, foolish desperation and tragic hubris, drifting without purpose upon the unpredictable currents of the Empyrean. Mighty empires rise and shatter in the light of distant stars. Entire generations turn to dust. Yet this floating graveyard endures across the eons. It remembers nothing, but it meticulously keeps every single trophy. The great conglomeration of misery turns blindly in the dark, caught endlessly in the tides of the warp and the material universe. Elias was but a single drop of blood spilled into an endless ocean of rust. His ambitions, his sins, and his profound terrors have been erased, absorbed seamlessly into the localized hellscape of the labyrinth. Now the silent, freezing husk of his beloved ship serves a new and parasitic purpose. It is simply another metallic scale layered upon the rotting skin of the cosmic Leviathan. Its distinct Imperial architecture protrudes slightly from the chaotic mass, a recognizable and inviting shape amidst the twisted Xenos madness. It is a perfectly crafted lure. The Carrion's wake is fresh bait, waiting patiently in the unending black. Someday, centuries or perhaps millennia from now, another desperate soul will detect its faint residual silhouette on a crackling auspex scanner. They will see the promise of easy salvage, they will hear the whisper of untold riches, and they will bring their own fragile vessel into the dark. The Leviathan will wait. The trap is set forever. In the grim darkness of the far future, the abyss always demands another sacrifice.